kind of stuff. And anyway, if you don't know, if you go through flight training in the military, you are graded against all of your peers. So you're given a score based on the last 228, I think, guys, or 200 and some. There's a number out there that's the last number of graduates, that based on their scores, how your score compared to their scores is how is your what's called Navy standardization score. And so if you have a 50 on that scale, you are on that average mark, right? And then it's all the bean counters and statisticians. They've got all this figured out, right? And there's a bell curve. And it was funny because in the midst of all this, the problem with this is that when you get into flight school in the military, you have, so on this bell curve, like a performance, you have all these people that are all like down here, like they all graduated top 10% of their class. And, you know, they all have college degrees and technical degrees and all of that kind of stuff. So they're all used to being the top, the top dog, so to speak, right? But now all of those people are in the same room. And now all those people are being compared against one another, right? And it was funny because my on-wing he's just this good old boy from Georgia. And he goes and he draws this line right down the middle of the board. And he draws a bell curve there like this, and he says, "I know this is how things are scored, right? If you're 50, you're right here." And he explains this, and he says, "Out here, this guy's about to go to test pilot school, and he's going to be the future astronaut, right?" He said, "This guy way down here is the guy that's still driving down I-10 with his blinker on, not changing lanes." Okay, so. And he said, everybody else is somewhere in between. He said, "This line right here, half of you in this room are below that line." You know, it's like, hello, this by nature, statistically speaking, right? What we're talking about is, we make these generalizations, is the person on that kind of that 50 mark right there, right in the middle, right? So as we talk about the average male and the average female, there are some truths that are going to be able to be talked about between those two. Obviously, the further we get out on those to those exceptions, but what we have a tendency to do in our culture, some have a tendency to do, is go grab somebody off of one end of these bell curves and go, "Aha, see, there are no differences." Well, no, that's not true. Just because this one woman in this one event can outperform, a man like this, doesn't mean that everything that we understand about men and women has to be turned upside down, right? Okay, that's a really long kind of story, but hopefully that'll help us as we move forward, talk about generalizations and understand what we're saying and what we're not saying. So, and as we consider gender and culture, just as a reminder, these two kind of work together, right? Culture does not give us gender. Gender is always expressed through culture, okay? So you can't get gender except expressed through certain cultural norms. And Paul actually reinforces this when in 1 Corinthians 11, that's a text that we've looked at, we've dealt with a couple of times, where he talks about the relationship between men and women. And we said, like, regardless of our interpretation of that text and the things that people want to get all sidetracked on, what Paul is affirming is that there are some distinctions between men and women in any culture, whether it be the culture of the New Testament, but he appeals all the way back to the created order, saying that these should be kept and maintained through all of cultures, through all of time. And so expressions of gender through culture are important. Now, this is this is one of the more significant gender cases in, and again, my last qualification for these slides, right? I've got a lot of stuff on these slides. These slides are to keep me moving, all right? I'm not expecting you to get and to keep everything, because there's so much, again, that I want to cover based on the last 6 years I've been kind of delving into a lot of this stuff. It's to keep me moving, okay? And to keep so that we wind up somewhere in August and not still stuck on the first topic we started talking about. All right, so this case is a significant case. This was a case that was written about in lots of books, and pretty much any gender study books you deal with today are going to have addressed this case in some way or form. In fact, even some of the folks that I referred to here in a little bit said, yeah, they were taught this case in their books. They remember being taught about this case when they were in school, studying in school. And it's this, it was referred to originally as the John Joan case. What happened was there was a family that had a set of twin boys, and one of the boys was, looking around, we don't have any little ones in here, so one of the boys was messed up beyond reparation during circumcision as an infant. And so, well, the prevailing thought, I mean, this was in the heart of the thrust of second wave feminism, okay, that was making a whole bunch of assumptions. And the assumptions were at that time that gender has absolutely nothing to do with biology. It has everything to do with, again, it's this false dichotomy. It has everything to do with social construct, right? And so it was the parents, under the advisement of doctors and psychologists and everybody, decided to raise Bruce as Brenda and to just complete the transition, so to speak, and then to raise Brenda as a girl, even though Brenda was born as a boy. And so, well, initially, so Brenda grows up, and again, twins, same context, same family, same, there's a lot of similarities there. And so all of the social scientists are like, yes, this is finally proof that all this stuff that we've taught for thousands of years is a bunch of nonsense, right? So initially it was heralded as this phenomenal success that Brenda was raised as Brenda. Brenda was a girl as much as any other girl was a girl, and everything was fine. Only subsequent studies that came behind to actually interview and talk with those folks who had been involved in Brenda's life, almost to a person, said Brenda was anything except a normal girl. Okay, she was actually way more aggressive than the other girls were, making the other girls uncomfortable around her, and then would list all of these sorts of things that said, yeah, this didn't actually turn out like it was made out to be initially. So, essentially what was demonstrated is that the assumption was wrong. Eventually, Brenda was told about this, and just in case you're looking for this, there's a New York Times article all about this in 2004 that chronicles kind of the whole story of this. But Brenda was told about this, and Brenda went, no kidding. So Brenda decided to become a man again, David, and eventually got married and had a wife and lived what was seemingly a normal life, as normal as can be given all of that, as a man, until sadly at 38 years old, David took his life. So I bring that up to say a couple of things. Number one, that's sobering. That should sober all of us. What's at stake with a lot of mess and a lot of lies that are going on all around us right now in our culture. Secondly, the lesson learned from this is that from a researcher standpoint, what I learned from this is that if we're not careful, our biases to see a certain outcome from a research perspective can lead us to either jump to conclusions too early or to find conclusions that aren't actually there, right? So it's a caution for everyone when we come to talking about these sorts of subjects, particularly when there's so much emotion involved in these, that we want to exercise caution that we are at least aware of our biased tendencies when it comes to research on such a topic. All right, and I say that because we'll see this, and then we'll hold that thought, come back to it here in just a second. But thirdly, the most importantly for this is that it demonstrates this one case that, again, is a case that is pervasive in a lot of the writings in this area out there, is that there's a lot more to all of this than just hormones and upbringing, okay? That biologically, there's things in us that cause us to act and react and respond in certain ways that are tied to our biology, not just our culture or any sort of notion of what men and women should be. My phone keeps going on. So Leonard Sachs, he's one of those guys that I mentioned that he said, yeah, hey, I had to read about that case. And he talked about whenever he was in school. He's an interesting guy. He has both his MD and his PhD. So sharp dude, and kind of two little different disciplines there. He talked about that and as he writes extensively in this area, he talks about these different stacks of books that he has, and he's got this whole shelf of books that says that, you know, that there are no innate differences between boys and girls, and he's got this whole other shelf stack of book that says that there are innate differences between them, and you see his quote there. These books have only one thing in common: they are based less on fact and more on their author's personal beliefs or political agendas. Right, so kind of just reinforcing what I said. One of the things we kind of learned from the John Jones case. But to quote Dr. Larry Crabb, who wrote Men and Women Enjoying the Difference. He had a BA in psychology and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Illinois. I'm sure if you've these kind of transition from psychology to biblical counseling, taught at a couple of different seminary and a Bible college, taught biblical counseling there. But he says he actually just died in February 28th of this past year. I didn't know that until I was just looking something up from him today. But he says there's an essential difference between men and women, a difference that is properly reflected in unique styles of relating both with their worlds and with one another. Now remember, we talked about, as we look at the biblical concepts of masculinity and femininity, we talked about that those are both expressed, even biblically, but culturally as well, in relation to one another. Right? So just think about it. It's next to impossible for us to talk about one without considering how it relates to the other. You know, so you can't say men are more this than without having that to compare them to, right? So if we were how they relate to one another and how they relate to their worlds are two aspects that we need to keep in mind here. So what's going on? So Van Leeuwen wrote a book on kind of where she talked about these 6 forks in the road, and I'm not going to get all into the science of this In fact, if there's a biology major in here, I might just yield the floor to them for 30 or 45 seconds. Any biology majors in here? So here's essentially what has to happen. There are 6 kind of what Van Leeuwen calls forks in the road, kind of so to speak, that have to happen for all of these have to line up both one way or another for us to have an unambiguous male or female. Okay? Now, 5 of these are prenatal. Now, 5 of so beginning with the chromosomal, obviously, XXY, we understand, like if nothing else, we understand that one, right? But that XXY then has very huge consequences for everything that takes place in the womb beyond that. All right? And so all of those are prenatal except for the puberty hormonal, which occurs when a boy or girl goes through puberty, right? And so all 6 of those have to line up, male, female, for that individual to be what's called an unambiguous male-female. So some of those outliers that we talk about, that we want to reference and then say, oh, well, that disproves the norm. Well, no. Typically what has happened is that one of these has not lined up with the others. And so maybe there's a subtle hormone, or maybe there's a male that during that normal time in gestation when they would get that testosterone bath, right? It doesn't occur exactly like that. Or, you get the idea, right? But I bring this up not to have a science lesson, but to think about, first of all, like Carabeth being born, Jeremy's not here, but this Friday, like every time you see a newborn, it's just a reminder of how incredible life is, right? And even just seeing the life is incredible, but then you start to think about like that God worked all of this so that we could have boys and girls, right? It's just is incredible. So a little bit of a science lesson there. I know, I apologize for those of you that aren't interested in that, but all right, so moving right along. Moore and Jessel wrote a book called Brain Sex. And a couple of folks referred to this as the best primary text we know for getting a whole picture on a worldwide scale of brain-based gender differences. They say, Moore and Jessel say this: the last 10 years paint a remarkably consistent picture of startling sexual asymmetry. It is time to explode the social myth that men and women are virtually interchangeable. So their conclusion in writing is that as they look at the research and they look at everything that's out there, like the more we know, the more the research says, hey, there's differences. Duh. Like, hey, we've known that for thousands of years now, right? But research kind of keeps pointing us back to that picture. And the words there, remarkably consistent, I think are valuable and helpful. Like, there's not a lot scientifically that's going against this, okay? There's the more research we do. Now, I will say this. Our understanding of the brain, okay, I'm a preacher who's studied this stuff, okay? So I'm not going to hang myself here. I'll just say our understanding of the brain is very minimal. Okay, we don't understand a whole lot more about the brain and its development and how it functions than we actually understand about it. Okay, there's still a whole lot that's unknown when it comes to our brains and to how they develop and to how, so there's some pretty significant, we'll say, academic volleys, maybe back and forth about with some of this stuff about the brain and brain development, but there's still some fascinating stuff, and so some stuff that's helpful for us to take a look at. So, but they say this: we know that genes, remember XY, from the very beginning, right? Chromosomes carrying the coded blueprint of our unique characteristics make us either male or female. And every microscopic cell of our bodies, men and women, are different from each other because every fiber of our being has a different set of chromosomes within it, depending on whether we are male or female. Okay? So if you think about that, at the genetic level, that goes down to every single cell of our body. And we're going to talk about some practical, physical manifestations of that we see here in a little bit. Okay? Men are different from women. They are equal only in their common membership of the same species, humankind. To maintain that they are the same in aptitude, skill, or behavior is, they're Brits, so apologize for the spelling there, is to build our society based on a biological and scientific lie. So basically what they're saying is, and they wrote this some years ago, but they're saying that today we are building our society based on a biological and scientific lie. Now, these people, most of these people aren't believers. Like most of these people, in fact, several folks here that I'll talk about here in a second are actually feminist authors who are writing and summarizing some of this stuff for us. So. The sexes are different because their brains are different. The brain, the chief administrative and emotional organ of life, is differently constructed in men and women. It processes information in a different way, which results in different perceptions, priorities, and behavior. All right, so we'll talk about that here, and we'll come back to some of that here in a little bit. So Greg Johnson is a biology professor who has written some on, he wrote an essay in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and he wrote the essay on basically physiological differences between men and women, and some of this stuff is fascinating. He talked about differences in bones and in tissues and healing from wounds and likelihood of healing from infection. So I don't have these slides for you, but just listen to some of these differences, right? So he talks about the metabolic rate is higher in males than in females. So basically our metabolic rate, our turning of calories into energy, okay? So 6% prepubescent, 10% after. So men after puberty have a 10% higher metabolic rate than women do. Again, we're talking about the middle of the curve here, right? Just as a reminder for that. We'll know folks who are on the continuum, but during metabolism, girls tend to convert fat to fat, where boys tend to convert to muscle. The typical 18-year-old girl has about twice as much fat as a boy, with about a 33% body fat index. Boys at age 18 have about 50% more muscle mass than girls do. Boys typically have denser, stronger bones and tendons and ligaments than girls do. So all of those, and in fact, also I don't have this in here, but women's tendons and ligaments tend to be softer and more flexible, more pliable than men's, which if you think about it is really pretty big deal and pretty important when it comes to childbirth, right? But it also means that we should have different expectations for what men and women can do physically. And I know it's like heretical to say that these days, but again, we're not talking about secular religion, we're just talking about God's truth here, right? So I saw this in the Marine Corps over and over and over with women who were trying to keep up with men with all of the stuff that had to be carried. And I mean, we're not talking about carrying 20 or 30 pounds, okay? Like we weighed it. So I know, like not my sustainment gear, but just my gear that I had to put on to go out of the wire, so to speak, weighed over 80 pounds. Okay, that's not sustainment. That's not the big pack with like something to sleep and take care of me for a couple of days. That's like 1 day's worth of water, ammunition, radio, battery, protective gear, weapon, all of that stuff was 80 pounds. So then you throw on another, how much, 50, 60 pounds of a sustainment load, and you're lugging around a lot of weight. Well, a lot of that weight that sits right here, right? If you have it strapped on correctly, you don't want it all on your shoulders. You got to have it balanced between your shoulders and your hips with every step now, right? Well, if ligaments, how do you like that? Tendons and ligaments in this area particularly are more flexible, then what do you think ultimately happens is they begin to get irritated and inflamed and excruciatingly painful. Now, I have seen some women power through some incredible pain when it comes to that stuff, and I'm not knocking that, but at the end of the day, it was still prohibiting her from carrying the load. So there are real practical things that again, how God designed us, how God made us, we have to keep in mind. Males have more sweat glands. We can sweat more, we can dissipate heat faster. Women have thicker subcutaneous fat. Well, what this means is they have a better energy supply for endurance events. This is why, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? The longer the event from an endurance standpoint, then the closer the gap is between the performance of men and women. Right? So the gap between men and women on your typical, like your marathon race, is much less from a percentage-wise than the gap is on a 100-meter dash, where you get those large, big twitch muscle movements that males exceed at, right? From an endurance standpoint, the longer the event, kind of the closer that gap, and again, it makes sense based on the biology. Men have larger windpipes and 30% more lung capacity. Males have larger hearts, can pump larger volumes of blood. They have 10% higher red blood cell count, so they have higher hemoglobin readings as well, and they can carry more oxygen. And so this rapid clotting and this higher basal metabolic rates all lead to more rapid healings of wounds and bruises. So men heal from physical wounds and bruises faster than women do, based on all of that stuff. But women have an advantage too, because they have more stored and circulating white blood cells, and they produce more antibodies faster than men do, and their bodies respond faster to infectious diseases, so they actually respond to and heal faster to internal things. And so which if you see from a woman having to take care of a home and a baby, that's pretty important stuff, right? Again, we can see all part of God's design. That's not an exhaustive list. I'm just trying to give you just a snapshot of like what's out there and the differences and stuff. All right, so remember we talked about earlier about brain development and some things here. This is some pretty interesting stuff. So Gurian and Stevens, Kathy Stevens and Michael Gurian, both feminists, both avowed feminists. Basically, they essentially did a study of studies. Okay, so their book is a compilation of a study of studies. They didn't do their own study. They just looked at all of the studies that were out there and said, based on all of the studies that are out there, these are some things that are consistently that we see. Developmental and structural, girls' brains develop faster. As one who's had a girl and 3 boys, I know it's anecdotal, but yes, that is a fact, okay? And it's a long time before boys even come close to catching up with that. In fact, we're waiting for that. We'll see when that happens. Somewhere in their 20s, I think, they'll finally kind of come back somewhere close, right? Girls' brains contain more neural connections between hemispheres, right? So the paths, plural, between the 2 hemispheres in women's brains are much more numerous and much more active than in a male. So this is why this leads to all sorts of fun stuff that we're going to get to here in a few weeks about why it takes me a while to even realize what emotion I'm feeling, let alone try to actually connect some cause for said emotion and figure all that out, right? Whereas for a woman, sensing an emotion, knows why and all of that, what it is, recognizes it. It's this back and forth hemispheric communication between the two hemispheres of the brain. There are differences in chemical and hormonal, functionally different. Boys tend to use different hemispheres. It's more spatial and abstract. Girls tend to use the other hemisphere, more memory, sensor. Again, with the brain stuff, there's still some. I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. There's a whole lot that we don't understand about this, and so definitely in processing emotions, as I just mentioned. All right, so what does all that lead to? So all that leads to this. This is what kind of noticed that the tendencies, again, center of the bell curve here, some tendencies for girls tend to be more inductive. In other words, to work from concrete examples to a principle. All right, tend to be more concrete, tend to use words as learning. Girls talk when they learn. Girls talk more, period, but they talk when they learn, right? So I read this whole book. There's this woman who was this writer who was like screaming mad through the whole book at this old wives' tale that women use 20,000 words a day or whatever it is. I don't know what the figure is. There's some word that's out there that's popular in culture, and she says. And like, so the whole book is about how she just these studies are all overblown and they all make all this big. The difference is only 9,000 and 6,000. Typical woman uses 9,000 words a day and a typical man uses 6,000. It's only 50% more words. So I'm like, so anyway, that's sort of some of this, you gotta read and you can't help but laugh at some of it, right? Girls prefer everyday language. They're better listeners. Anyone want to argue against that? We're gonna have some fun with that here in a couple of weeks. So stay with me on that. Less space. They need less space, less movement, and they prefer written text. All right. So boys, again, prefer deductive. That's that movement from a principle to a concrete act or action or whatever. They prefer abstraction. They learn silently. They prefer jargon and coded language, logic and evidence. They need more stimulants. This is why putting a boy in a classroom in a seat at a desk all day at 6 and telling him he has to sit there all day long is close to child abuse, to be honest. And why boys are constantly being diagnosed with ADD when they're not ADD, they just need the opportunity to get up and move around every once in a while. They need more space, they need more movement. You can ask my wife. I walk 1,000 miles a week in our house, and on Sundays when I'm preaching, on Saturdays, I double that. Like I pace. And I walk and I move around and I've got a book over here and a book on that. And I'm like, I need some space and some room, right? Per images, diagrams, symbolic text, give a little boy a map with a key on it and man, his world lights up, right? Girls are like, most of the time, it's pretty colors. They don't really care about the symbols and all of that, but all right. So they talked about, again, Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, he referenced this Psychology of Six Differences, that landmark review of psychological literature. And so of that, Maccabee and Jacqueline, they draw four, I know I'm not giving you the background for this, but basically four summary statements about girls and boys. from all of their research. Girls have greater verbal ability than boys. Boys excel in visual spatial ability. Boys excel in mathematical ability, and boys are more aggressive. The boys being more aggressive and higher risk takers almost are universally accepted, and we'll talk about that. If y'all want to come back to that, I'm gonna finish out, and then we'll come back to have some time for questions here. I'm gonna just skip this. So I'm going to give you a brief statement of this, okay? So a guy named Howard Gardner, you've heard these multiple intelligences, right? These different intelligences are out there that are 7. Well, basically, Gurian and Stevens took those 7 intelligences and compared them to boys and girls and how they performed with each. And 5 of the 7, they noted distinct differences in how boys and boys and girls with 5 of the 7 of those multiple intelligences. So Leonard Sachs, again here, he wrote a book called Why Gender Matters. It was updated in a second edition in 17. He noted differences between the sexes in sensory perception. It's fascinating, sensory perception with women. And it explained some things to me that I went, wow, that's no kidding, right? Like a woman's sense of smell is on the order of like 2,000 times a man's sense of smell. And what happens is when a woman smells a smell, then she can smell it, like it goes from that to like 20,000 times more perceptive of the same smell once she smelled it. Whereas a man, it does the opposite. So this is why, I don't know if y'all have this in y'all's home. Maybe we're the only couple that has this. Where Carrie will be, well, man, what is that smell? And I'm like, I don't smell anything. What's the problem with it, right? So it's so sensory perception. Like they do these tests with pins and needles, like on skin, right? Women have more nerve endings, and so like the distance, a woman's ability to tell when the difference between 1 pin and 2 pins connected really close together, touching one another, like women win every time. Right? Men can't distinguish it, and women can tell, no, that's 2 different pricks, not 1, right? All of this kind of stuff. Attitudes towards sexual activity, some fascinating stuff in that we could get into, but that would take a whole other lesson. Responses to typical school environment. One of the things that, well, I'll just jump ahead to that. I'll go ahead and go to this. Sachs, a couple of things. Yeah, last 2 slides here. Sachs affirmed that the tendencies for boys to be more aggressive and more willing to take risks. And he said universally, sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. I got it on my screen right here. Universally find that boys are more likely to engage in physically risky activities than girls. Universally. Like studies all around the world, like he looked and looked and looked and did not find a single study, not saying that it doesn't exist, but he could not find one that demonstrated that boys were not higher risk takers than girls. And one study was fascinating. I got to take time to tell you this because it's just funny. Like, so there's a study. They get these boys and girls and they go into a room, and they go into a room individually. And so here's a task. There's a bucket in the center of the room, and they give them 6 balls. And the task that they're assigned to is that they are to put the balls into the bucket. Okay? Pretty simple task, right? So, girl goes into the room with the 6 balls. What does she do? She walks up to the bucket and she goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Boys go into the room with the bucket. What do? They look at the bucket, they back up, they start throwing the balls at the bucket, right? Now, no one's told them, like, they've been told the same set of instructions, right? But boys did this. They would throw the ball at the bucket. Like, they would see how far back they could, so they're missing the bucket. Like, the only objective was to put the balls in the bucket, okay? They don't know, like, okay, that's part 1. Here's what's fascinating. Part 2. So the next time the girl comes into the room, sitting along the wall over there, there's some girls. So now they're doing this in front of a group of girls, right? So what did the girl do? Girl walks up to the bucket in front of the girls and goes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now what do I do? Boy comes into the room. There's boys lined up along the wall. What does boy do? Nope. Boy backs up, on average, 50% further from his previous time when he threw the balls at the bucket to now throw the balls at the bucket. Okay, again, nothing's changed. The instructions have been the same. It's just fascinating. But when you think about it, and so there's the last example, and I know I'm running into my question time here, but it is this. It's the nonsense of what we have going on in our culture right now. When you consider the push for certain ideological agendas at the expense of our children. There's a really simple solution to fixing a lot of our issues when it comes to our schools. And it would be simply this. Now, it passes out when I say this because you're going to think, right, well, we did this for centuries, right? Yes, we put boys in this classroom and we put girls in that classroom. And it's Gurian and Stevens that's what they do. That's their line of work. They go out and they teach educators, and they teach them that there are ways to teach boys and there are ways to teach girls, and we're hurting ourselves in some ways by not acknowledging that. In fact, Leonard Sachs backed that up whenever he says studies in the United States and around the world universally find nope, sorry, wrong one. There are girl-friendly approaches and boy-friendly approaches. And the disparity in performance between boys and girls in schools is less often due to the innate differences, but how those innate differences affect how they learn and how boys and girls learn, which is the touching point for what I wrote. The whole point of my dissertation as I was considering preaching that was directly addressed to men was how do men and women learn differently? And what are some of those approaches that better communicate to men and women? So we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about this cross-cultural communication thing called genderlect, where men and women try to have a conversation with one another and are constantly talking past one another, right? So we're gonna unpack that in some coming weeks, and we'll talk about when women communicate, they're trying to do something completely different than what a man is trying to do whenever he is communicating, right? It's completely different. And when we don't understand the purpose that each understand communication for, we talk past one another in a lot of ways. And so that'll be fun. And then we're going to get into a whole bunch of other stuff moving forward. So I'm past my time when I would normally stop and ask for questions. So he's loaded. He told me Sunday, he's like, I wish I could think of some harder questions for you. So he probably got online and Googled something. I don't.
Talking about splitting boys and girls up in classes. Are there any countries that do that now, and are there performance differences?
So, yeah, what they did, so the question is regarding splitting boys and girls up. And so I'm almost positive it's Gurian and Stevens. I'm having a drawback in my memory, but as they go around and as they teach these, I could be wrong on that because I've got a bunch of stuff, names and things in my head right now. But the two authors who wrote the book that were dealing that were dealing specifically with learning differences between boys and girls, and some of those slides, there's a couple of slides in there that either I missed and I didn't address, but anyway, they have actually gone into school systems, and school systems, this was 10 or 15, 20 years ago when they were still open to actually entertaining the idea that this might actually improve school systems. Every school system that they've gone into and implemented has demonstrated an increase in all sorts of performance measures for both boys and girls. So there's empirical data to support the fact that if we were to do this, now it's not the silver bullet to fix our educational system, but there's empirical data that would support that performance for both go up whenever we separate and we teach to both in ways that are considerate of the different ways that they learn and develop. I don't know the answer to that. As far as if there are countries that do that now, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've seen some schoolhouses in Africa and some other places that are segregated by gender, but I don't know that. I suppose that information may be out there, but I'm not. My knowledge of it just touched on it tangentially as I was working toward the learning differences. So, yes, sir.
I'm a teacher, and it's about 7 years ago to kind of prove your point. It was Hopewell Middle School, and what they did is they separated boys and girls, and they did it for 3 years. Saw test scores go up for girls, test scores go up for boys, scoring off the chart, great things were happening, and parents got upset. They said, "You got off soon, and they can't do it."
Yeah, and that's typically what happens. Is they go in, they demonstrate that this actually works, and this isn't fair because we're treating men and women differently, and so, well, yeah, because they're different. But anyway, then, yeah, we have to put them back together. And it disproportionately disadvantages young men, because if you look at how girls learn, girls tend to be able to learn better in ways that is not ideal for them than boys do. And there's some reasons for that. Namely, the girls' brains develop faster, right? So a girl, even if she doesn't get it what's in the classroom, because she can read and she remembers more of what she reads and everything, she's automatically going to make up, in a sense, for what's lacking in the classroom more than a boy will. And there's all sorts of dynamics that go on with that. So it's fascinating. I'm sorry if I'm boring. I hope I'm not boring y'all with this, but it is. What other questions?
Well, I'll just back up with you. What brain research tells us is girls, we know their brain is fully developed at the age 20. Males, 27.
Yeah. 20 and 27, those kind of ages for fully developed brains for girls and for boys. So, and that's, not even considering if the boys play football or not. So, yes, sir.
From that, I'm just looking at Genesis 2, verse 18, and then the Lord said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper who is right for him." So, most of these studies you have quoted, you mentioned, were done by people with not a Christian point of view.
Yeah.
But those who have, do they make any references to Genesis?
Well, so if you read from those who are writing from a theological complementarian point of view, absolutely, there are references there to that Genesis text, and we spent a whole session on that one chapter in Genesis talking about that a few weeks ago, and just as a kind of reminder. I didn't put it up this time, but it was Augustine who said kind of all truth is God's truth, right? So even when we see things that are true out there, and he was referencing obviously with rhetoric and the use of rhetoric and Christian preaching and the spread of the gospel, but it's true with this as well as social sciences. Is again, I'm not trying to prove the Genesis text by talking about this, but what we're seeing this is a fuller understanding of what Genesis tells us about the truth of what we see in that text there in Genesis chapter 2 for sure. Other questions? So here's what we'll do next week. We'll pick a man and a woman, and we'll have them come up here one at a time and try to explain some things to one another, and we'll laugh at it, right? No, don't. I'm not going to embarrass you. I'll embarrass myself, okay? So, but we'll talk about communication some next week, and then we'll get into a series of books. Post that. We'll talk about a series of books called For Women Only and For Men Only. And we're going to unpack some of the truths that those authors help us see and understand about one another. So they're actually the books that I use for premarital counseling. It's the books that I require those that I'm going to marry to work through and we talk about. So good stuff. All right. Father, we thank you again for tonight. Lord, we do again as we end all of these sessions. We thank you for your good and gracious and amazing design of men and women. And Lord, for how as we look at this, as we consider this, how, Lord, it just leads us to a point of further awe and wonder concerning who you are and your design and all of creation, Lord. And I pray that out of all of this, our response would be the proper response to worship you. So Lord, I pray that as we continue to move through this subject matter, through these topics, Lord, that you would lead us to a place where we worship you more. Not only with our words and in our time here together, but with our lives as we go out and live lives to be the men and women that you call us to be as your people. So God, we thank you. We thank you for your son, Jesus. We thank you for his sacrificial death and resurrection for all of us. We thank you that because of that, Lord, we have life, hope, understanding, and Lord, wisdom. Lord, we thank you, and we love you, and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.